I grew up outside of a religious tradition. I grew up in England. Both my parents are Dutch, and I believe, apart from Denmark, Holland is the least religious country in the world. I didn't know anyone who went to church. I didn't really know anyone who was religious. And when I came out as a teenager, religion was either irrelevant or cruel. I did not see much point in it. It seemed like hocus pocus, and I just had no time for it. But as I grew older and I became a climate activist as a young man, I was very involved in mobilizing young people around the United Nations climate change conference. I started to see how the leaders that I was most inspired by and the stories from history that seemed to be most impactful in changing culture and changing policy, religion kept showing up in this interesting way. Congregations as centers of organizing, spiritual practices that sustained leaders through tremendous difficulties. And I grew slightly interested. So by the time I came to graduate school to do public policy, I kept meeting people from the divinity school, which I thought was just for Catholic priests. Like, I had no idea what a divinity school was. And it turns out it's this much broader exploration of culture and meaning and community and ritual and justice. And I felt that here was a place that I could learn about the things that I had a sense of longing for, that I couldn't explain and couldn't quite have language for, but that spoke to me in some way. But as I entered the divinity school, I was not religious. And so I kind of looked around into the world, into the US, and saw this massive kind of social shift that we're in the midst of declining religious institutions and increasing social isolation. So let me just ask, who here grew up going to a congregation regularly? A church, a synagogue, a temple, anything? Who today regularly goes to a congregation? A few handful, yeah. This is a totally unscientific poll. We have 2 PhDs on our panel, so let me just say this was not a good representative group. But nonetheless, I think that story illustrates some of what's happening in our country in a very short amount of time. There is tremendous decline in attendance, in practice, and also the way in which we describe ourselves. So famously, my generation, the millennials, more than a third of us, when asked what religious tradition or community are you part of, tick none of the above. So we are known as the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S, rather than our Catholic sisters. And new data from Pew that's coming out in the fall will show that Gen Z is even higher than that. And across every age group, actually, across every generation, silent generation, baby boomer, Gen X, each one of those is seeing an increase in the disaffiliation of people from religious traditions. So much so that there are more than 3,500 churches that close every year in the United States. The United Methodist Church cannot keep up with its normal processes to help churches close because they're closing at such a fast rate. And this trend shows up differently in different communities within the Jewish world. 70% of non-Orthodox Jews marry outside of the faith. And even amongst religious communities that are growing, so Buddhism, for example, or Islam, often through immigration, there's often a real generational gap in terms of how people relate to their tradition. So the phenomenon of unmosqued young Muslims is now a thing just as much as unchurched young Christians or people who grew up with a Christian context. And the language that we have to describe ourselves, those who sit outside of those traditions, is very, it's shaped by negation. So we are the nuns, the none of the above, the unaffiliated, the spiritual but not religious. There's a real hesitancy to affiliate with any institution. And that's not just in religion, of course, that we see that anti-institutional frame showing up in all sorts of places. But it means that there is very little positive labeling. There's very little opportunity to gather around a new identity. But in my work, what's been so interesting to see is a rise of community organizations that are wholly secular, fitness communities, arts groups, justice groups, maker spaces, that nonetheless fulfill the kind of things you might expect to see in a religious congregation. So one of my favorite examples of this, just because it's so extreme, is CrossFit. Do we have any CrossFitters in the room? Yes, you brave few. I always like to say, and I can say this as a Harvard man, how do you know if someone does CrossFit, goes to Harvard, or is a vegan? They tell you. And so, I'm sorry I outed you, forgive me. But there's this very evangelical zeal within the CrossFit culture, right? When you want to open a CrossFit box, which is not just a normal gym, but these are group classes that are very high intensity. If you want to open one of these gyms, you have to go to a 2-day seminar, and you have to write an essay. And in this essay, they're not looking for your business acumen. They're not even looking for your fitness background. They're looking for one thing. Has your life been changed by CrossFit, and do you want to change other people's lives with CrossFit? So it has this very kind of powerful evangelical zeal. And people are living their lives, their community-oriented lives, their meaning-making lives in spaces like these gyms. Weddings and funerals are held in these spaces. There'll be drinks after work on a Friday. There'll be mums groups. There'll be talent nights where people pick up the cello for the first time in 20 years. When someone's diagnosed with breast cancer, people are raising money for each other. In Southern California, politicians are doing stump speeches in CrossFit boxes because they're such powerful communities that hold each other to values and to account to live out those values. So there's this really interesting civic infrastructure that doesn't look anything like religion on the surface, but once you start to look at the behaviors, starts to look mightily religious indeed. Another example is the dinner party. Not just a dinner party, but an organization that brings people together in their 20s and 30s who've suffered loss at a young age, perhaps the death of a parent or a loved one. And this started out of the way so many of these communities start, out of necessity. Lennon Flowers and Carla Fernandez and a few others had lost a parent at a young age, and every time Mother's Day came around or Thanksgiving came around, it was the moment of the conversation killer. You know, are you going to see your family? Oh, actually, my mum's died. Oh. And so they wanted to be with other people who just had the same experience with whom they could talk openly. And they started to get together for dinner, very simply, a potluck meal. And more people came, and suddenly someone in Chicago and someone on the East Coast, and suddenly there's 400 tables with community hosts that are helping to just create space for people to talk about life after loss. The fullness of that life, not just grief and suffering, but the new chapter of life that it has given. Sometimes the relief, sometimes the joy as well as the sadness. So all sorts of communities were popping up that were interesting to us, in part because they seemed to be doing these religious things. But nonetheless, we live in a culture of growing isolation, as you know, and I feel this is a real theme this year at Aspen. We've heard David Brooks, of course, and so many others speak powerfully to this. Today, 1 in 4 Americans say they have no one to talk to about the things that are most meaningful in their lives, and that includes family members. 1 in 4. 1 in 5 always or very often feel lonely, 20%. The increase in mental ill health, whether anxiety, depression, all the symptoms of feeling disconnected showing up. I've spent the last 3 years living as a proctor in the Harvard dorms with freshmen. And just to see even, these young people are 18, 19, 17, the generational gap between myself and them was already startling when it came to some of the mental illness challenges. And of course, also our impact on our physical health. Being isolated has all sorts of impacts, of course, addiction, even suicide. But even a diagnosis of cancer, you're more likely to find a diagnosis sooner if you're well connected, because it takes usually up to 4 people to tell you should go get that thing checked out by the doctor. And if you don't have 4 people in your life who are going to tell you that, it takes longer before you end up in the doctor's office. So all of these kind of social isolation pressures are having enormous impacts on our health. So my question is that I really want to explore today is the challenging invitation between our desire for community, our hunger for belonging, that sense of wanting to be part of something bigger than ourselves, and also, especially in America, our fierce joy of individualism, the freedom of choices that we get to make, the way we express ourselves, the power of our individual creativity. And as we look at meaning-making as a frame, perhaps in that dialectic, to remember some of the ways in which communities help us make meaning. So, for example, when we talk about community, very often we think about it's just a relationship between you and me or you and you, that there's this kind of social connection. But community is much richer than that. It places us in a story across time, a sense that we know where we come from, that we have peoples and ancestors and communities that we come from that give us a place in this moment that makes sense within a longer history. We have a calendar that we live in time as it passes. We have rituals that mark moments of transition. We have ways of connecting to the place in which we live. The way in which community is not just a social connection, but is a connection across these different layers of meaning. But these structures also constrain. As a gay man, I'm really glad that I didn't grow up in some religious communities. Religious communities have had many times very strong boundaries of what keeps you inside, and if you break those norms, what keeps you outside. So in this conversation, I'm not looking for us to return to some kind of 1950s idyll for so many reasons, but I want us to start thinking about what might be new structures of belonging that we can create, which honor our individuality and the gifts that we have to give, but also force us not to only ask the question, who am I, but whose am I? Who are we in relationship with, to whom we will submit ourselves? Who do we trust enough, and what structures are we willing to create for one another that will hold us to do things that we might not always want to do? I feel that tension. I don't know if you do in your life. I want to be able to just go on an adventure every weekend. I don't want to show up at the same place and do the same boring things. So that tension is what I want us to explore today. And our speakers this afternoon, as they become even more properly wired, are going to help us explore that very question. We have with us a wonderful crew led by, on the very end, Armony Glover. Armony is the co-director of the Sanctuaries in Washington, D.C., a community that uses arts-based strategies to transform social division and systemic oppression. I was lucky enough to learn about the Sanctuaries 5 years ago when I was an intern with her co-creator and co-director, Rev. Eric Martinez-Resley. And Armony has also co-led the Women's March this year and is a Greensboro Justice Fellow at the Highlander Education Center, one of the great jewels in our social justice history in the United States. We also have Rami Nashashibi. Welcome, Rami. For those of you who don't know by now, and I'm sure there are only a few of you, Rami is the co-founder and the executive director of the Inner City Muslim Action Network, IMAN, in Chicago. He is a 2017 MacArthur Fellow, has a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago, and is a leading voice in social justice and interreligious dialogue. We're so glad to have you with us. Thank you. And finally, but certainly not least, Sarah Heminger. Sarah is the co-founder and CEO of Thread in Baltimore. She's a scientist and a social entrepreneur. She has a PhD in biomedical engineering from Johns Hopkins and has been an Ashoka and an Echoing Green Fellow. Sarah is just one of the most visionary leaders I know, and I think has built with Thread one of these structures that really offers us a solution of how to be in relationship with one another, to live meaningfully, to serve a greater purpose. So I'm very excited to hear from all three of you. And the first thing I'll ask is just for each of you to describe what it is that you do. I think at Aspen, so often we hear about the wonderful ideas that people have, but I want you to get a sense of where those ideas come from. What are the communities that these are grounded in and that they come out of? So perhaps, Armony, would you lead us and tell us a little bit about the Sanctuaries?
Absolutely. How y'all doing? I come from a call and response background. So I'm often going to check in with you to see how you are and if you're following me and if you're here with me. And so the invitation is, if I say, how are you doing? You can just say, good.
Good.
Right, that's okay. Yeah, that's so good. So again, my name is Amini. Amini means faith. Isn't that interesting? And my faith walk so far has led me to the co-creation of the Sanctuaries, founded by Eric Martinez-Resley. And I was able to join him in this mission at a pivotal point where we got to choose where we want to go in healing disconnectedness and establishing what it means to be well across cultures, across faith. And so sanctuaries was bred out of that yearning of different types of people wanting to connect with each other authentically. So what is authentically? Meaning that I can show up as all the different sides of myself and be okay. So I don't know about you, but sometimes when I meet someone new cross-culturally, one aspect of myself, I'm gonna dip my little toe in and see, does that work? Can you connect with that? And if you can, then maybe I'll go forward. If you can't, maybe I'll try another aspect of myself. And then you know what I'll always do? I'll smile. Maybe that's the language that you'll relate to. So what we do at Sanctuaries is, what is the language that we can relate to across these seeming boundaries of culture and faith, or non-faith, or understanding, or non-understanding? What we find is that we're all searching and seeking meaning, nothing new. We may call it another name, we may go about it in different ways, but we're all dipping our little toe in to see, does this aspect of myself connect with you? Similar to what I just did, telling you that I come from a culture of call and response. And would you participate in that with me? Because when I say, how you doing? You say, I'm all right, I'm good. And some of you did that. Some of you may not be warmed up yet. But the opportunity is, do I have the fortitude to keep trying and keep trekking? Sanctuaries is more than space, more than people. It is a calling to heal. My mother, beautiful woman, really teaches me. This is one story that she always would tell me as I grew up. She was deeply in love with my father. I mean, just her everything, her sun, her moon, her stars. Have you heard songs like that? My sun, my moon, my stars, all of that. That was my father. He's transitioned, so I'm speaking in past tense. And my mother would always talk to me about this love, and that the heartbreak that came out of this love, and then that there was a choice in that grieving, in that despair, whether or not to go on. There was a choice whether or not to hold on to this side or to move to another side, that she had a choice in that. And she will always speak to me about, she saw it clearly. If she went one pathway, she would continue to be here with me. And if she went another pathway, she would have made a choice to give up and transition. It was very clear for her. So I grew up hearing this story over and over again about choice. And so that infueled me that the power of choice is my own. And I want to connect with those parts and pieces that encourage me to stay here. And we believe here in Sanctuaries that connecting with people cross cultures, cross every perceived boundary, is that fuel to stay here, that we are connected past these identities. So in Sanctuaries, we're constantly cultivating the soil. We're constantly sculpting away, what does it look like to authentically create meaning, show up as myself and be all right, to be safe, to be brave, to dip my toe in, to dip another toe in, to dip another toe in, see if it works and if it doesn't work. And if it doesn't work, I can still say I can take a break and come back. So it's looking at how to build community in the time of now. It's a precious question. How do you really stay connected to yourself and others? There's been times that I felt that I had to lose myself to be connected to you. Is that true? So it's a deep questioning. It's an open abandon for curiosity. I really do believe that curiosity says that I can continue to question things, and that one day there will be an answer that's suitable for me to continue to move forward with in a meaningful way. So Sanctuaries is at that cusp of questioning, at that cusp of interfaith understanding of how to be with one another, from atheist to devout Christian to devout Muslim. We are here all co-creating some soil that says that we can breathe in this world when sometimes often it feels that I can't breathe. So thank you for having me and sharing some stories and some college. Are y'all all right?
We all right.
We're good.
Oh, you're getting so good. Thank you. Warmed up right.
All right, so how do you follow that?
Well, don't worry, I'll give you a minute. Amini, thank you so much. Would you help us see what the Sanctuaries looks like in DC in terms of what do folks do? Like how do you build those connections?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we do is that we build power, we shift culture, and we heal spirits, all through innovative arts-based strategies. So that means that you have a visual artist who pairs with a grassroots justice campaign, the climate march specifically right here, or the women's march when I was leading, and you take your visual artistry and you work work with that grassroots justice campaign to see, how do I create a banner? How do I create a poster? How do I create a puppet? How do I create some form of visual arts that speaks to the meaning of what you're doing? And this is nothing new. It's been done since the beginning of time. How do you activate people visually? And so what we do is we partner with these artists, we teach these artists, we train these artists up in strategies of how to get at things from different angles, how to keep dipping their pinky in, their toe in from different angles, because it's going to take gentle nudging. Sometimes it's going to take a great disruption. And we're showing you how to stay resilient, how to honor yourself, how to speak to these different aspects and identities, and how to shake things up. We are meaningful disruptors in DC to what is norm. So it can look like training. It can look like pairing you with a grassroots justice campaign to actually do the work. It could look like creating a CD to get the message out, creating a PSA to get a message out about domestic violence. We have a number of partners that we work with on their campaigns, and we infuse it with arts-based innovative strategies.
That's powerful.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Rami.
All right. I'll try to follow that, but with the energy. I hope, first of all, Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings be upon you. Ashe. I said earlier, this is my first time at an Aspen Institute gathering, and I still feel like I'm a little bit on a magic carpet ride. I was sort of like acclimating myself to the terrain. But it is so, I think, I found myself in a conversation just the last couple of hours with someone. We were just charging our phones, and I think it's such a privilege and a beautiful blessing to be able to have this space in place to just engage one another and test out that and to push each other. I'd say for Iman's work, I'm so inspired hearing. I've heard so much about being on this panel with you, and in so many ways, as I describe Iman, I think you'll see a lot of the model. But Iman is the Inner City Muslim Action Network, and Iman, like your name, also means faith in Arabic and Imani, Swahili. And it is, an organization now that's 22 years old. We incorporated in 97. I'm the founding executive director, but I've always had an extraordinary team, and people have been with us in the trenches for really a quarter of a century. Come out of a experience that was really molded on the south side of Chicago. Some of you, Asia Butler, of course, you heard, a sister of ours, and certainly work in and around the same spaces. A place that my mother grew up in as a one of the first Palestinian refugees to find herself on the south side of Chicago in May of 1948. Although I came back to the south side very much as an outsider. I had grown up for most of my life in, at least 7 different countries, 12 different cities, moving different schools, going through a whole journey myself before I landed back in the United States for college. But one of the things that Iman grew out of is an experience that made us realize in the early 90s, mid-90s, that the American Muslim community, even at that time, had an eclectic set of experiences. On one hand, on the South Side, deeply rooted in an extraordinarily dynamic Black American Muslim experience that comes out of a tradition from, of course, the Great Migration to great cultural, political, artistic, thriving, dynamic resistance to, quite frankly, the extraordinarily tremendous structures of white supremacy and racism in a city like Chicago, to refugees and immigrants that were coming from all over the world. And again, we settled in the same type of patterns that were, a major urban center like Chicago was producing. So immigrants were settling in different spaces. There were certain spaces where there was lots of overlap. And in this particular neighborhood on the south side where we started the organization, you had that at one point was an exclusively kind of the last bastion of an ethnic white stronghold that had been moving away from Black migration, constantly trying to toe the line. Finally, by the mid-90s, it had become now a predominantly Black and Latino community that is moving from another part of the city, and also a port of entry for a lot of, Arab and immigrants and refugee children who are now growing up. And that's where really the cauldron of the organization formed, and we started an organization that was committed to the idea of health, wellness, and healing in the inner city, drawing certainly from our tradition, but realizing that we needed to form an alignment within in our community to then form meaningful bridges across other communities. Fast forward 22 years, the organization has really grown. We have a full-time chapter in Atlanta. On the south side, it's now a $10 million plus operating organization with several $1 million in just capital work. We have kind of these four arms, if you will, that are all really work in collaboration in much of the same way. We really stress a holistic approach to health and healing. And so we have a holistic health center. It's an FQHC lookalike right now and aspiring to be a full federally qualified health center, God willing, in the next year. And that in that health center, there's everything from primary care to intense behavioral health to oral care, and it's an extraordinary health care that is very connected to every aspect of our work that we do. And we have clinics, and we have spaces, and physicians and providers that are very integrated into our larger work. We have an arm that is an organizing and advocacy arm, and we take on the issues. And we're, Chicago, we're kind of dyed-in-the-wool community organizers from Chicago, but that have thought a lot about the tradition of, for instance, an Alinsky IAF community organizing tradition through the lens, though, of faith, and through the history and the prism of other organizing models, from the Panthers to the organizing traditions of Central American movements, and have thought through that in a way that is attempt to integrate it genuinely and holistically through an organizing training that we now facilitate across the country. We've had hundreds, if not thousands, of people that have gone through our organizing trainings and lead campaigns and have passed laws around criminal justice reform. We work very heavily on that issue, whether it's housing, and very intensely in food justice work. We have a campaign called the Corner Store Campaign, and partly because of the messy intersection of, and also dynamic intersection of predominantly Arab immigrants and other Middle Eastern immigrants who sociologists would dub middleman minorities in the post-70s and 80s, who kind of settled in predominantly low-income Black communities, took up and were presiding over businesses, corner stores, liquor stores, fish spots. In many urban centers, you probably found this, whether you're in Oakland, whether you're in Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, New Orleans, lots of this was present. And in some very real ways, there was intense tension between the store owners and the residents. And so for us as an organization that was coming out of a very diverse kind of Black American and urban kind of experience, it just made sense for us to tackle this campaign in all of its complexity. So I'll maybe speak to that later. But so the organizing arm, the health center, and then we have a huge part of our program called Green Reentry that works with returning citizens and court-involved, young, dynamic opportunity youth, if you will, 18 to 25-year-olds, often the same demographic that are very much caught up in the cycle of violence, either being shot or being very vulnerable to being those who are shooting, and part of a program that is about taking vacant and vandalized homes in concentrated blocks, using those sites as a trades rehabilitation training program. So there's in-class and on-site training, but then there's also all the behavior health. There's all of the other things that go on, including drawing from our last kind of arm, the artistic piece, which is something we've taken very seriously since our inception. I mean, a lot of us kind of really were convened in spaces around arts. I mean, for me, one of the first powerful convening spaces that in some ways, I would say even challenged, our social science theory about the role of faith and religion is, because so often social science is drawing from Eurocentric paradigms, or paradigms that don't take into consideration a lot of the other models. My dissertation was looking at, the gangs and looking at hip hop and looking at the different type of alternative spaces that were being created on the south side of Chicago. And hip hop, for instance, was such an extraordinarily powerful convener that in many ways was drawing very authentically on faith traditions, was bringing the black, brown, and the white kids and together in very interesting spaces, allowing them both to kind of authentically represent themselves and also contribute meaningfully to the cipher. We take the cipher very seriously. You know, the cipher, if you've ever been in a hip hop cipher, is where, you know, you saw Common last night, you know, drop in, everyone feels free to drop, 16 bars and rhyme, and you're your authentic self in a cipher. I've taught at a collegial level and have been with kids who would not say a word in classroom, and then I would find them in a cipher and they were waxing poetically, and I would pull them right back in class and say, you're gonna be talking for the rest of the quarter, and I would make you leave, because I just saw what you're capable of dropping. Right. And so, but the cipher also, for us, is a powerful symbol of the power of the arts. The arts is a convener. Cipher also comes from, etymologically, comes from the Arabic word sifr, right, which is the zero, right? And of course, one of the contributions to, mathematical civilization was the contribution of zero, right? Where would Mark Zuckerberg be without the zero,
Indeed.
Right?
Indeed. Just
all
ones.
the computer algorithms that would, the ones and the zeros, right? I don't know how you would appreciate that if he was here. I couldn't tell yesterday. It was last. Don't want to get Facebook sponsors. We all appreciate Facebook, right?
We'll leave it
Okay, Anyway, but having said that, the zero also was the zero also was the profound, the essential metaphor, the supreme metaphor for the divine, the infinite, no beginning, no end, right?
No
and so the idea to, in the sacred tradition, you go back hundreds of years to the Sufi traditions in the Muslim and other mystical traditions that would gather in the circles and do the practice of dhikr, of qar, remembering the Most High. And the idea is you would remember you of course probably are familiar with the whirling dervishes and the other forms of mystical circles, but there was the idea that you would remember and also forget in that circle. You would remember great things, you would remember things greater than yourselves, and you would also then forget the things that disconnected you from being in that circle, including some of the things that have traumatized you. You would shed those things. And so art for us for the last 20 years, from major, we have an arts and culture department that runs huge festivals to major kind of arts convening spaces. We have an arts roster made up of 70 artists from across the country. And our arts, to be on the roster, you have to apply. And part of our artistic kind of definition of the artist is that you are spiritually rooted, right? Whatever tradition you are drawing from, you are socially conscious, you're thinking about the world, and you are spatially relevant, right? And we ask that you draw off all three of those things in the space that you bring. And so Iman as an organization now really draws from all of that in our work. So we'll have our behavior health therapists doing also art therapy in a ceramic studio that we run on the South Side. And so much of the work over the last 24 years has been about what we talk about, especially through the arts, about radically reimagining the world, radically reimagining, in community organizing, there's a conversation about the world as is and the world as could be. And
let's get back to that, right? Because I want to make sure we hear from Sarah as
well.
well.
I'll finish that.
Yeah. Beautiful.
So much of it, all of this is about, and for us is about radically reimagining what could be.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yes.
Sarah, tell us about Thread.
Sure. So Thread is a community of people in Baltimore, Maryland. We've been building this community for the last 15 years. What we aim to do is to build a movement to end social isolation and create community where everyone feels seen and loved and known and understood. And part of the reason we feel this is so important is that we think that by doing so, we actually can realize what was originally intended in the civil rights movement and bring about racial and social economic justice. So for me, I'm a huge nerd. I kind of always start in the science, which is, if this idea of social isolation hasn't yet resonated with you, just to put a fine point on it, you've made a convincing case that we're more isolated now than ever, but what does that amount to? What that amounts to is the longest standing human research study in our history came out of Harvard. 724 men followed from their early teens and 20s into their 70s, 80s, and 90s and just asked a simple question. What would be the predictor of whether or not they were happy and healthy? Who would have cancer, dementia, heart disease? And at first they thought it would be things like educational attainment or race. It turned out that the predictor was something quite simple, which was, did you have a handful, 2 or 3 close relationships that when it really mattered, when you needed to call someone at 3 in the morning, that you had someone you could call? I'm Italian, so it's like we always say, do you got a guy? Like, do you got a guy when it really matters? And the men who had that were the ones who actually literally had less cancer, dementia, and heart disease. And so when we are suffering from social isolation as a society, it is impacting our health. Highest rates of suicide, mental illness in our country in ways that we have never seen before, and it is impacting people of all demographics. I've also experienced this from a very personal side of thing, just kind of lived through different forms of trauma and oppression myself. So first at birth, I was born not breathing with an APGAR of 1 and a facial deformity, which made school somewhat difficult in terms of kids teasing. But then when I was 8 years old, I was actually kidnapped from my house in the middle of the night by someone and miraculously was able to escape and make it home. Shortly after that happened, I grew up in a very religious community, and my father found out that the pastor of the church that we were attending was misusing money. When my dad revealed that to the congregation, instead of firing the pastor, they decided to shun my family. So for 8 years, from the time I was 8 to the time I was 16, no one could speak to me. We'd go to church 3 days a week. Other kids, adults, my own cousins, aunts and uncles. So in some bizarre way, I had this, life experience very early on where I had this deeply connected inner circle within my family, my mom and dad and my siblings. And yet I faced a lot of different trauma and oppression throughout this time. And so for me, Thread was really founded to address this social isolation. The way that we build relationships across lines of difference is we enroll high school freshmen who rank academically in the bottom 25% of their class. So the average GPA of, for example, our first cohort at Douglas High School was 0.15 on a 4.0 scale. Our students face enormous challenges outside of the school day. Once they're in Thread, they stay with us for 10 years. It is longer than your average American marriage. And it's permanent. So once you're in Thread, you cannot get out of Thread. You have to opt in, but we really mean that. In 15 years, we've never unenrolled a young person, because you don't unenroll someone from your family. You didn't birth your child and be like, didn't really like this one. Let me try again. And so in Thread, then, each young person has 4 adults. Those 4 adults, the way to think about it is, what would you do for your own children? And thinking about it, if you have more than one child, each of your children is different. So you're not going to do the same thing for each child. You might drive them to school. You might pack their lunches. You might help them with their homework. Well, that's exactly what we do. The 4 adults in Thread do those things, but they also might help a parent find a job or help a younger sibling get enrolled in daycare so the parent can actually work at the job. And so for us, the journey has really been one of, the reason that we started with high school students who were underperforming is that my husband, we lovingly joke, was the first Thread student. So he grew up in a working class family. His mom was in a bad car accident. Because of that, she couldn't walk, she couldn't work. They lost their home. They moved from suburban Indianapolis into public housing. She became depressed and addicted to drugs. Then she began selling drugs to support her own habit. That all coincided with his transition into high school. So instead of worrying about how he was doing academically, he was worried about, what am I going to eat? Is the electricity going to be on? Am I going to have clothing? Just the basic human needs. And so incredibly distracted. And there was just a group of teachers who said, yeah, no, we're not going to let this happen. So instead of just telling him, like, work harder, do better, they really saw who he was and what he was going through. And so they would pack his lunch and give him rides to school. And what that did was it made it a lot easier for him to make decisions. It's easier to go to school if you don't have to take 3 buses and have a ride. It's a lot easier to go to school if you aren't hungry and have food. It's a lot easier to go to school if you have clothes that are clean and you're not worried about smelling bad and being teased. And so the thing that, I think has been, for him, he ended up graduating from high school, going on to the Naval Academy. We've now been married 20 years come next week.
Congratulations.
Longer than the 10 in the average, beating the average.
You're
Okay.
doubling it.
But the point is actually something quite different, which is we've learned something really critical and very slowly, unfortunately, over the last 15 years, which is I thought in the beginning, when I met our young people, I was sure of it, like nothing was wrong with them. They are not broken. Like all I saw was beautiful, talented young people. And because I had an N of 1 that said, like, I just thought, like, if Ryan could do it, everyone could go to the Naval Academy. Like that was the data that I had. What I did not understand was just how profoundly broken the systems were and how profoundly oppressive they were. And that was something that came gradually when our first cohort of students all graduated from high school. They all went to college. They finished college. And then they came out of college and they couldn't find jobs. Right? And so you have enough experiences like that, it's this gradual awakening of it's just not as simple as checking these boxes of education. And then it goes deeper, right? So I think about it, it's like lazy eye, kidnapping, and cult aside, like, my life is actually pretty normal. Like my trauma had a very distinct beginning and a distinct end. My kids' trauma doesn't.
Right.
Like 84% of the schools in Baltimore City, you cannot drink the water in the schools. 42% of all youth in Baltimore City have at least 3 ACEs. Like, this is not normal. It is not normal to have helicopters flying over your house at night. Like, my life is now normal. Their life is, like, they continue to experience this trauma and this oppression. And so when we think about, like, what is Thread really doing? Yes, we are graduating young people from high school. We are checking those boxes. Those are critical. If you take young people in Baltimore City that have a GPA of less than 1.0 in their freshman year, only 6% graduate from high school. In Thread, that number is 71%. If you extend out to 6 years, it's 85%. So yes, that is important. But that is not enough unless we change how we function as a society. And the change can't just be something that's legislated. We've tried that. That hasn't worked. Like, we've integrated the school system. When we think about Dunbar High School, the school that we were founded at, our school system was integrated in 1956. And what we ended up with was white flight out of the city, followed by middle-class black flight out of the city. And so now Dunbar High School is actually both racially and class segregated. So in many ways, you could describe it as actually being worse than it was in 1956. And so what we're really trying to do is create, one, a set of non-dominant norms for how we treat each other. What we're not interested in is creating a diverse community where we welcome people into white spaces.
Yeah.
That is what we are not doing. What we are doing is figuring out how do we create a non-dominant set of norms where every single person, exactly as you were saying, can be their full self on day one. So instead of having to do this, just able to jump in because you're in an environment where it's understood that that's how we're all going to show up. And then having the ability to simultaneously hold, okay, that's a tradition and a culture and that is core to who you are, and how do we hold then the thing that's core to who I am at the same time with mutual respect and admiration, right? So it's not that one of us has to lose who we are for the other, but it's how do we hold those things at the same time. So that's the culture we're creating, and that's the ultimate change we're looking to see, is how do we create a societal change in the country as a whole, where we learn to behave differently. Because the lie that I think is being told is that this dominant set of norms is only bad for poor people of color.
Right.
Like, we've got to get that out of our heads.
Can you say that again, Sarah? Because it's really important to hear.
Yeah, the idea that dominant norms are only bad for poor people of color. Dominant norms are bad for all of us. Like, look at the opioid epidemic. The fact that white women between the ages of 35 and 50, my demographic is going to be the only demographic in our country's history where I will die statistically younger than my mother. The only demographic. What is happening to middle-aged white women in this country? Two things are driving the death rate. What are they? Suicide, overdose, just a slower form of suicide. This is what we're really talking about, right? So when we begin to get to the point where we can understand, it's not about a group of haves helping a group of have-nots. It is that my ability to thrive is inextricably bound up in yours. Like, I can't do me without you doing you. We have to figure out how to do it together. And so that's the community we're building, at least attempting to build. And it's like messy, it's difficult, it's super uncomfortable. But a dominant culture norm is a right to comfort. So we've thrown that way out the window. There's nothing comfortable about what we're doing. But it is beautiful. Like, when you're in thread, you can be your full self in a way that brings about a freedom that comes from the inside. It's not something someone can give you. It is something that just, where there is a space for you to just fully be yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so powerful. Yes, for all three of us, thank you. Friends, let me just invite you to take a deep breath. Thank you. Sarah, you started to touch on some of these systemic drivers to disconnection. And I think in our dominant culture conversations, there's a lot of conversation about social media, there's a lot of conversation about technology, which is definitely all real. But I want to hear from you three, what are some of these other drivers towards disconnection? Rami, you were talking about housing policy. You talked about schools. Like, what are some of the other things that in your community you see folks are struggling with because they're being driven by our dominant culture towards disconnection? Whoever's ready to speak, we can popcorn this round.
Oh, popcorn.
Well, I don't mind just quickly picking up off the the housing piece, because you mentioned it when you were talking about the schooling and the flight, and it just made, if we look at the segregation in our urban centers across the country and what it produced, because our urban center realities are not disconnected from our suburban realities, like you're saying, we're all interwoven. You take a city like Chicago, on September 12, 2001, a predominantly Arab American community on the southwest suburbs had to confront, literally, probably a group of around 150 people with Confederate flags storming the mosque. They had to call SWAT teams to kind of encircle the mosque. Having said that, that reality is not disconnected from the urban realities that have created this segregation. Those same individuals were very intimately connected to families that moved out of neighborhoods, that saw themselves under siege, who were confronting king and marchers who felt like they were losing everything. They were sold a lie that said proximity to the other, and particularly in the United States, proximity to blackness, right? In the early 20th century, when whiteness is being created as a social construct. Before that, in a city like Chicago, you were Italian, you were Lithuanian, you were Polish, you were in these neighborhoods, but the very structured ways in which the presence, large presence of black folks, particularly coming from a really, when we talk about the Great Migration, sometimes we can mistakenly feel like it was just a bunch of families packing the station wagon and going on a nice trip. It was a reign of terror, as Brian Stevenson and others talked about. And when you think about what families were fleeing from and fleeing to, right? It was really terror from, on the way, and when they arrived, just another form of a lot of that. So the structural pieces then that led to those very angry people who find themselves in a neighborhood like Bridgeview, now confronting the other, in this case, Arabs or Palestinians, who they feel like we've been running our whole lives. We've been made to our wealth and our accumulation of wealth been threatened. And so those structural policies that have created the climate that I think we see on a large scale nationally now have really been embedded very mechanically. There was a book called American Apartheid, written in the 80s, that really helped to give you the real mechanics of redlining and restricted covenants and all the ways in which we take for granted now the very segregated realities that have created communities that are not only disconnected from one another in the type of interpersonal way that you're talking about, but kind of very disconnected from even having to drive by one another. There was a moment where sociologists used to talk about the Gold Coast and the slum phenomena in the early 20th centuries, where there was kind of wealth juxtaposed with extraordinary disparity. But at that point, at least the folks living in the Gold Coast had to ride by the slum. Now we live in realities where gated communities and kind of distant reality you don't even have to drive by it and see it. So I would just say that those ongoing structural mechanisms, coupled with the fact that we have yet, even in today's moment, we really unpack the very real ways in which we've, notions like whiteness or how we've identified our very irrational fear of the other that still pervades, and it's undergirding our culture. And it's not like we very rarely are our students, college students, or even certainly high school students, given the real tools to unpack how prevalent those ideas still are in the way we think about the world or the way we navigate our neighborhoods.
Thank you, Rami.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rami and Sarah, when we're talking about housing and we're talking about housing injustice and we're talking about gentrification. One of the major nonprofits that we work with in DC is Empower DC, which is a long-standing organization that has been fearlessly fighting for housing justice in DC, specifically in Ivy City, a Black neighborhood where there is no place for young children to play. There's no place for young children to go. There's no place for them to continue to grow and foster the understanding of who they are and to know the rich history of Ivy City. And so the fight for home is so real. But I would offer that it's real outside of ourselves as also inside of ourselves. So as we are working with our artists and our multicultural interfaith community, we're constantly meeting the barrier of mirroring each other, but not wanting to see that reflection, right? And so battling oppressions. And so if I say that I am a Black woman and it's challenging for me to make ends meet and to pay my bills and to come into this workplace and to be seen, and you are a Muslim woman and you're having your disparities, how do we have a conversation across those borders? How are we breaking down those systems that say that we are against each other? How do we break down those systems that uplift againstness? So the duality of how we're doing this work in community with community is really present when we're working with partners like Empower DC that are constantly struggling to make sure that these communities that have been around since DC was created are still there, and that their landstones, their landscape remains intact. We're also thinking about that internal struggle too. How do we remain intact in this fight? How do we stay present to this fight? How do we stay present and accountable to each other? And so I would say the system of perfectionism that's present in whiteness is really at the central combining tool of loneliness. I have to be perfect with you in order
That's
to
right.
cross these boundaries. I have to show up perfectly. I cannot make mistakes. And the same thing is present in when we're doing this battling for housing justice, when we're constantly out here. How many times are we going to pick it up when this system, as you said, Sarah, is constantly on our backs saying that it can't be done? How many different angles can we come at and try again, and then also face that mirror of againstness that is created through the isolation of white supremacy. So I would say that those systems are constantly breeding in our work, and it's constantly just more than a sore spot. It is a boulder that knocks down, and I have to choose if I'm willing, able, or even equipped to get back up.
So Amini, and forgive me, Sarah, I want to jump on this because this is exactly where I want to go, which is what are the practices then within each of your communities that do exactly this, that keep people resilient? What are the practices of meaning making, of integrating those experiences, physical practices, emotional practices, and then also what are the relational practices? Like, are people making art together? Like, what is happening in your communities that do that meaning making connection? Can you talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our community, like you said, it's messy.
Yes.
Right? And so, especially in this time and age now that says that I can block you when it gets messy. I can block you when you say something I don't like. You know, I can choose to look away. I can choose to put up some shield that I am no longer dealing with you because you crossed that line and I'm complete in this relationship and complete in trying to understand who you are. We face those daily in an interfaith multicultural community. And so what we do is we go on that growing edge of saying what needs to be said. You may not have thought it well out. You may not have a hypothesis, a thesis, a whole understanding of why you feel this way, where it's coming from. And it may hurt, and that's okay. And so it gets very, very messy. It gets very, very chaotic, which means that all of my stuff comes up. There are wounds in the way. And so authentic relationship says that I can acknowledge those wounds in a way. I can acknowledge when and where I enter within them and how I want to deal with them. And so in our community, what we do is we do create art together. We do create that space where there are some words that the trauma is so deep that I don't even know how to talk to you, how to look you in the eye in a real way, how to even be in the same space. In our fellowship training program, we're constantly training how to deconstruct those different levels of white supremacist thought and how we deal with one another. And even in the word deal, there's an energy. But that's the truth of where it is right now.
Yeah.
You know, even in the word of how can I deal with you? Like, how can, you know, the level of toleration, like you said, is really present. How do we continue to sculpt away at that? And how do I continue to be willing? So art is central to it. Because if my spirit is depleted and I am giving up, then I can come back with a call or response. How y'all doing, y'all?
Oh, we're good.
You know, and bring in a community saying. Community sayings have been central to Black communities, to indigenous communities. Less saying, similar to what you were talking about, 0 points and circles. The power of a circle, the power of a cipher, the power of hip hop artists coming together with visual artists, the power of working something through in a tactile way, the power of embodiment that says that I can come up and stand in my body and be safe with you and work some things out, that I can just shake a little bit right here, just to shake something off. That there is
Feels
power
good.
in that, right? There's power in that. And so the practice is, how do we be with one another? Through art making, through practice of coming back to something that I don't want to come back to, through the resilience of knowing that if I make a mistake, I am not the mistake. A mistake was made, but I am not the mistake. That's big in trauma healing work. I am not the mistake. A mistake has been made, but I am not the mistake. So really deconstructing that through art making has been big in our community.
Beautiful. Thank you. Practices. Yeah.
Before practices, I just wanted to comment. We had just taken a trip down to EJI.
Yes. Which,
and
that's a practice.
Yeah.
Travel together.
Oh, we definitely traveled together.
Yes.
Longer story. But one of the things that we had asked their staff, we were looking at these photographs, and the photographs were of the lynchings, but the photographs themselves focused on the faces of the people in the audience, not on those being lynched. And someone asked why. One reason was to not perpetuate normalizing violence against Black and brown people.
Yes.
But another reason why was to acknowledge that anyone in this room has been born into these systems.
Yes.
We have all been normed into this culture. And what they pointed out is there was this little child looking up at the person being lynched, this white child, and they said, that is a form of child abuse. What was happening to that white child is a form of child abuse, right? So thinking about the psychology of all these, like all the various angles and how it impacts people, it's just incredibly, I think, complicated. But in terms of practices, you know, we use kind of 3 basic things to like add rigor to help with the mess, because it is messy. So we have a set of norms. There's 16 norms. These things outline the ways that we're going to behave when we interact with each other. So it's things like call a thing, or we value directness with kindness. So if we have lunch together and I have something between my teeth and we go through the entire lunch and you don't tell me, I'm not sure you're my friend. Like, if you can't tell me that I have something between my teeth, you're likely not going to tell me something really important that I need to hear about how I'm showing up in the world. And so these sets of norms guide how we're going to behave. One of them is assume the best of intentions, right? So if you can just start in any conversation with something just happened and I'm upset, what is the best possible version of what I just heard, or the best possible intention that this person could have had? It'll change your entire way of reacting. So we have norms. One of those norms is just incredible vulnerability, right? And modeling that by the adults, having the adults model what it is to share openly and be vulnerable. But to have norms isn't enough, because you have to actually create what we use as spaces and structure to deploy the norms repeatedly, over and over and over and over again. The thing about this is not new. There are lots of institutions who figured this out. There are like really no new ideas. I'm sorry to tell you at the ideas conference, there are no new ideas. They're just ways of implementing them differently, right? The military is a good example. The military is a very clear set of norms. You know, when you meet somebody that's been in the military, they make their bed differently. They shake your hand differently. They look you in the eye, right? So there's lots of institutions who have said about a set of norms. The challenge is the norms have often been oppressive norms. And so how do we then utilize those structures and spaces in the same way to set a new set of norms? And so that's what we do. So an example of our structure is we believe everyone in Thread is on a journey of growth. And that is about finding what we call your dot. So your dot is your intersection of your passion, your skills, and what the world needs. In order to do that, you need to be in relationship with others, but you also need a coach. So it's really hard if you're a volunteer in Thread and you drive to a young person's house to give them a ride to school, and for like 11 straight days they refuse to answer the door. That's difficult, right? And so you need someone to help coach you through that. So there's a person called a head of family. The head of family coaches the volunteers, not just on all things Thread, but on life. Because often what causes people to step out of relationship isn't just conflict in the relationship, it's something outside of it. Maybe that volunteer is struggling in college themselves, or in their marriage, or with their children. And so if they can get support, they're more likely to stay in the relationship with the young person. But the other piece of our structure is we have what's called collaborators. Collaborators are people who provide pro bono services and expertise. So if someone's going to be evicted, an attorney might provide pro bono legal services to prevent that eviction. And so what we find is our structure, we use our structure not to function in a hierarchical way to reinforce this oppressive culture. But instead we use the structure to create access to people who want to find each other. So if we assume the best of intentions, what I've found is most people want to get together with people different than, they just don't know how. Like society has got us so segregated. Like if you wanted to go have lunch with someone that you view as different, where would you find them? Like there's, like seriously. And so, you know, just like a great example of this, we had a young man, Raekwon, who had been badly brutalized by the police, had all his teeth knocked out, and as a result of this, missed a few days of work. This is years ago now. And when he missed work, ended up losing his job. So he said, like, hey, do you know of anyone who could like help me with a job? And we had a collaborator, this man, Roland, who his father happens to be this incredibly successful founder of a financial institution. But Roland had become addicted to heroin in his early teens. He had come out of that, founded a lawn care company. Now it's a multi-million-dollar business itself. And so I was talking to Roland, I said, hey, you know, do you have a job for Raekwon? He's like, sure. so we connect Roland and Raekwon. And what happens is if you were to talk to, this is maybe now 4 years later that they've been working together. One, Raekwon has really found like his community in that company and in finding his trade and like himself in that work. But if you talk to Roland will tell you that having gone through a divorce in the last few years and a number of other things, that the key to his sobriety has been his relationship with Raekwon. And so again, if you think about like who's the have-not, who's helping, who's being helped, it's utilizing the structure to create the access. And then it's when we come together in spaces, to your point, it's this great point, like, are we sitting in a circle? Or are we sitting in a row? Like, it's what food are we serving? Who's the food catering to? What songs are we singing? You know, the example, we had a holiday party and we were like really trying to figure this out because we were gonna have 700 people, a diverse group of 700 people, age, race, gender, class, like about as diverse as you can get. And we were like, how are we going to get everybody on the dance floor? And this might sound like a dumb thing, but it's really not, because if you get everybody dancing and they have a good time, like they're going to come back, right? And the idea is to make what's really heavy a little bit lighter,
and that's a practice, like
it's
dancing together.
It's a practice, right? Yeah,
exactly.
We love to dance.
Yeah.
So we said, okay, let's like, how do we want to do this? Again, like, it's not about including people in white spaces, but what does this space even look like? Right. So we started with West African drummers, dancers. They came in. Everybody was like, "What's going on?" And then all of a sudden, like the young people in Thread, like jumped out on the dance floor, and because they were doing this rope skipping thing, and then it was like you're standing there though, and you're looking at the dance floor, and it's like, all of the young black kids are on the floor and everybody else is just sitting. And we're like, So there's this guy, Sean, middle-aged white guy, and he just said, screw it. And you watch him, literally, he's like, screw it. He just goes out there and he starts going at it like all over the place. And what happened is he opened up the space. He didn't put his toe in. He was like, I'm going to get all the way in there. I'm going in. Somebody come with me. And everybody did. And so all of a sudden you find like everybody's out there, everybody's dancing. And then you look around and you're like, there's still some people sitting. Who's sitting? It was people over 50. We're like, okay. How do you then like make sure, right? But we had thought this through because we've been doing this for a minute. And so we played the electric slide, right? Because everybody knows the electric slide, right? And now all of a sudden, like you don't even have room on the dance floor because you got everybody going, right? So it's like, I know these things sound so simple, but they're complicated. When you bring together a diverse group, it's like you have to make the space a tool to reinforce the norms so that people understand, so that Sean understands in Thread, screw it, just get out there, right? Like, you know, and that's kind of like when we when we fail,
Right.
it's when we've either done something structurally or with a space that reinforces
The
dominant
culture,
norms.
yeah.
And boy, do you know it when it happens, and it's bad. It's really bad. And when we succeed, you can just like feel it in your body.
Thank you,
The
Sarah.
energy is just there.
Yeah.
So Rami, I'm going to give you just 2 minutes. Forgive
All
me,
right.
because then we're going to turn to our
No,
friends.
I mean,
who
I
have
think
patiently
so
been
much.
listening.
I think so much of what has been the practices are really articulated really well. I mean, I would say the way we summarize some of them, and they really resonate with a lot of what you were sharing, both of you. Talk about run to the mud, right? Run to the mess. Essentially embrace the mess. And all of the things that we're talking about, and mud, you know, the spaces that we work in, the marginal spaces that we work in, the intersectional, where bring all the issues. I also use another, both intersectionality has this kind of sexy buzzword kind of appeal right now, but it's relevant. But you know, a lot of our communities were intersectional long before, and a lot of our work was long before the term was being used, because it was really layered. And being able to work and exist in these spaces, you had to know how to be literally, you know, you had the literacy around intersectionality. The other thing is this notion of interstitiality, being willing to, you know, and I think both of these experiences, a lot of these practices speak to your earlier point, which is they draw deeply from faith traditions, and I think also allow us to recover the extraordinary relevance of those faith traditions in allowing us to really facilitate and fuel these extraordinarily critical practices. But it takes tremendous amount of faith and a greater power to be able to make yourself vulnerable to run to the mess. And muddy, and those spaces are muddy, they're messy, and mud has both the capability of making you feel incapacitated, stuck in the mud, but there's also power. There's a lot of spiritual metaphor in mud as being, you know, we have a tradition, كلكم من آدم وآدم من تراب. All of you come from Adam and Eve, and they came from mud, right? And it's a reminder, you come from this, you return to this. Remind yourself of that as you work with and alongside communities. And also this idea that mud is malleable, right? Mud has the ability to recasting yourself, reshaping yourself, building a new narrative together. So running to the mud, the other practice is mining the gaps, right? Being capable and willing and open to talking openly about the gaps between our professed ideals. Again, religious traditions have been good about this, right? When they're working in their best, challenging us to think about all these lofty ideals in our traditions that we aspire towards, and the gap between those ideals and our day-to-day lived realities. And not to ignore those gaps, not to feel like I'm a hypocrite because of those gaps, but to mine those gaps, to embrace those gaps, and to be aware of those gaps, and to speak about them, and to challenge one another. What does it mean to live our life as a relevant Jew, drawing from the extraordinary prophetic tradition, and then deal with this inequity? What does it mean to be a practicing Pentecostal, to go into a city where you have such extraordinary pain outside your doorstep, and you're going to sit through church service and no one's talking about it, you go back? What does it mean to be a Muslim that has to contend with notions of these great attributes of mercy and justice, yet you go in and out of the mosque and you're not charged to do something meaningful in the world? There's a gap there. Mind it, deal with it. And then lastly, I think the observation is that moments matter, right? Moments matter. And there's a difference between moments and events. And when moments, I think, are about being, so much of our religious traditions are about moments, right? It's the Via Dolorosa was a moment, right? There was a moment of Salim. There was a moment, and till this day, hundreds of millions of human beings across the planet have been mobilized, I think, in great ways, right? I'm one that still sees beauty and light in the faith traditions. I wasn't brought up that way. I've come to see that through my organizing work, through what I've seen faith communities do. And I think that's also a point that those moments, making moments matter, really helps to illustrate. It is critical to continue to lift up the role that faith traditions are having every day in communities to actually bring communities together. I'll end with this. One moment with us was really building the first memorial to Martin Luther King in the city of Chicago. And it was not a memorial, not just a big granite statue of King. It was a living memorial. We called it the living, memorial to King and the Chicago Freedom Movement. And it not only memorialized the moment that King was stoned in that park, but it also memorialized people like Rabbi Marx, Imam Morty Muhammad, and all of the marchers with them. And we also lifted up, and it was sculpted by our sculptors into brick, you know, and it was made in our ceramic studio, these images of what home. We asked to over 300 people, what does home mean to you? And they built that in the ceramic studio, Latina grandmothers, aunties, Arab folks, young kids, and then they stitched that into this beautiful mosaic that now sits on the bench of the memorial, and it's kind of this ode to building what a beloved community could actually look like, a home that actually encompasses us. And on the side of the memorial, there's home written in 8 languages, starting with Potawatomi, the original, you know, caretakers of the land, and then thinking about the notion of home in our languages. In Arabic, it's one of the words for home is it comes from the notion of sakina, sukun, which means a place of tranquility, right? And so what does it mean together to collectively build a home that allows us to feel like we are living in spaces of tranquility? And I think that's possible. And when we marched together to unveil that memorial, we gathered over 1,400 people. We built this over 2 years. It wasn't one pot of money. It was churches, it was synagogues, it was organizers, a hip hop activists. We brought it all together, and that march that day reassembled literally, and it was the largest march since that time when King marched over 50 years ago. And we marched on the 50th memorial of King in that community. And now, today, Marquette Park is not known as just the space of trauma where King was stoned, although we remember that history, but it was the space that we built a memorial that lifts up a vision of what a real beloved community could look like. And that moment continues to matter and endure and leave us with a possibility, again, of how we can radically reimagine the world together.
Thank you, Rami. So, a space of tranquility, what I'm going to invite you all to do is we'll just take a minute of quiet time. And I would like you, maybe if you have something to write with, if you have a piece of paper in front of you, if not, that's fine too. But just think of 3 words. 3 words that really stick with you from this conversation, from these powerful stories and inspiring leaders. 3 words. Can be anything you want. And then after that, I'll invite you to turn to someone next to you and just share a little bit about each of those 3 words and why they struck you. So just take about a minute of quiet, and then we'll invite one another to conversation. Thank you. Yeah, after that. The time is less than there actually is. The clock is fast. Thank you, everyone. So turn to someone that's sitting next to you, maybe at your table, and we'll take about 3-4 minutes just to share what resonated with you, what challenged you, and what are these 3 words? Why are they striking you now? And then we'll come back for some questions and answers.
Well, I really, maybe we should take off our mics to talk.
Great, thank you everyone. So we've got about 10 minutes left. There's much more conversation to be had with one another, no doubt. But what other questions that come up for you now, which our panelists might respond to? We have brave souls with microphones roaming the room. So who has a question for us? Right at the very back? Oh, there's one over here, and then we'll go right to the very back.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Oh, this is loud. Oh, my gosh. My name is Amanda Kunchbahari. I am representing from Minnesota. How are you all?
We're good.
Woo, good. Okay. Thank you so much to the panelists. This was a really great session. I was writing furiously, so that's a good thing. And my question is, because we were all kind of socialized under this system of whiteness, I'm really curious about how you all intentionally shed that and try to shed it so that you can then create spaces that are really authentic and allow people to show up as their true selves.
Beautiful. We'll have one of us respond to each question just so we can get 2 or 3 questions in. So if one of you is burning to respond to that, I leave the floor for you.
I'm always burning too.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Thank you for such a great question. I like that burning. That's a beautiful visualization. So it's much like my counterparts up here have been saying, you have to describe what it is. And so it can be vague to just say, whiteness. And so we say dominant white culture. And we name what the cultural patterns are so we can then decide how we want to disrupt them. And so we name them out. We say perfectionism. We say we're not going to, defining someone as a mistake versus making a mistake. We talk about urgency. We talk, and then we reframe it, that radical reimagination there. So how are we as disruptors, as radical disruptors, disrupting this pattern and co-creating a new one? And so it's so important for us to name those. And our naming comes from the People's Institute from Undoing Racism. They've done great work and great research in that. And so our structure comes from that. And then we have those interrupted patterns that we have.
Thank you, Amini. One of the great gifts when I interned, I don't know if you know this, but I did a training with them, which blew my mind.
Yes.
So highly recommend.
Amazing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Right at the back, we had someone in a jean jacket. Yes.
Hello, you guys did a great job, so thank you so much. I think in the past couple of years, we've seen religions really pitted against each other. So seeing you all speaking on stage together has been really great. But I'm wondering in this era when people are in such rigid thinking, where one religion must be held above all, how you try and break those barriers with people who are stuck in their lanes.
Thank you.
And what you would suggest with that.
So we did, we had a series, so one of the ways we've approached this is not just in the dimension of religion, but other lines of difference that also tend to have quite a bit of rigidity, is we started a thing where we asked people to just log an action that either initiated or reinforced a relationship. And over 1,100 people logged something. When I'm having a horrible day, I go back and read them because they range from like, I bought someone a cup of coffee to I called my mother who I hadn't spoken to in 10 years and forgave her. And then step 2 was we had 100 dinners at 100 different locations on one night with 10 strangers. So imagine that. We managed to convince 100 people to let us place 10 strangers at their house. Anyone could come. It was advertised to the entire city. It was free. And then what we did was we had a second set of dinners where there were 100 people each, 10 of them, so 10 dinners, 100 people each, and then ended with one dinner with all 1,000 people. And so what we did, though, is at each of those interactions, there was a facilitation where someone at each of the tables of 10 facilitated a conversation that helped bring people together in a way where they could really meet each other where they were at and start to see each other as human. And I think there was something to the being in people's homes aspect of it that was really, really important. So the 10 dinners on 10 nights, those were all at my house. And let me tell you, my house doesn't fit 100 people. So, I mean, it's just like this amazing level set of, you know, people of all ages, races, classes, sitting on the floor, sitting outside on the ground, eating. Like, and I remember, you know, we had, it was actually a young man, young black man who, as he was leaving, said, you know, thank you so much for having me to your house. I didn't really think anything of it because that was, in my mind, just like lots of people, there's like 1,000 people coming through my house over 15 nights. And I said, no big deal. Thank you so much for coming. And he said, you know, you're only the second white person's house I've ever been in. And I said, he's like, I work with white people. I go to school with white people. Only been in one other white person's house. And I was like, well, what was the other white person? And he said, Nick Greer, who's my colleague, who hosted him at the first dinner of 10.
Right.
And so I think my point is,
Right.
I think that there's ways to bring people together. It doesn't have to be 1,000 people,
Right.
but like invite someone for work over for dinner. Invite them into your home. Your home is the most intimate space. Like it will, your home reflects whatever your religion is. It reflects what your family, how your family functions. Everything from the food you choose to serve, right? Like that in and of itself, that radical hospitality, I think, is something that can be really used to help people start to see one another in a more fundamental and deep way. And we did this now, this last year again, with trivia cards over football games. And we just found ways to enter into conversations around bias. Things like one of the trivia cards was, what is the hobby of the Ravens kicker? Turns out he's an opera singer. And so everyone was like, what? You know, opera singer? And I'm like, why is that surprising to you? Well, he's a football player. Well, why is that surprising that a football player could be an opera singer? And so it allowed for entering into a conversation on bias that wasn't like, sometimes when you start with religion or race or class, people just shut down because it's just, we've been so like pitted against one another. But if you can just start with like, how do you feel about that kicker? Like it's a little bit easier. And to enter, so finding both the spaces, I think, in people's homes, but also finding ways to facilitate it that allow people to kind of, maybe it is put their toe in if they're not ready to jump all the way in.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. Let's have two more. We've got over here and then right at the back over there. So we'll start over here with this gentleman in the blue jacket.
Hi. Hello? Yeah, I'm Bruce Mckeever. And I just want to congratulate all of you for your compassion and your social entrepreneurialism.
Yes.
And I want to ask you, maybe Casper, you're the one that has to answer this. All the great faith traditions have been started by an extraordinary entrepreneur, a faith entrepreneur, Jesus, Mohammed, etc. And I think today there's something else coming out, and it may be a tradition, the same tradition, but it seems to be that it has to be some sort of difference, some sort of social entrepreneurialism that's coming out. And Casper, you're sort of dealing with this with the nuns and such. It's not the traditional forms. The old forms are getting tired and they're losing membership, and we're getting something else. But what do you think it is that's emerging in the new space that's going to replace our faith traditions? Because I think religion or something like that is essential to humankind. It is like, well, Bruce, it's a part of us. What's going to replace it?
Let me be the first to invite you to the session that's starting in 20 minutes called Transforming Traditions, where we will be exploring exactly that question. And you will hear the great Harmony Glover speak there as well. But in all seriousness, I might take this one if I may, if my gracious panelist will let me. I think you're right. I think we are seeing new things develop. the ones that are most exciting to me are the ones that are in conversation with the ancient, where the emergent and the ancient meet together. And so I talked about one set of nuns before. There's an amazing group of people called Nuns and Nuns, where literally these unaffiliated millennials are partnering with Catholic sisters to be in conversation together. And they've just finished, a group of them, a 6-month residency in one of the physical buildings in which the sisters live out in California. And the way in which that group is reimagining what vowed life might mean, what poverty, chastity, and obedience might mean in the 21st century is so stimulating and creative that I think you're really onto something, and I think the answer is it's too soon to tell because we're right in the middle of it. We are wrapping up. Annie is telling me it is time to move on. There was one more person. Please feel free to come up and ask your question in person. Thank you very much for being here. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you to our fabulous panelists, Sarah, Rami, and Amini. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.